Hello and welcome to Your Life in 10, Series 1, Episode 9, with the writer, journalist and campaigner Toby Young. Enjoy.
My first job when I left university was working at the Times as a news trainee. But I got fired after 6 months because every morning when I came into work for 5 minutes or so, I used to try and guess what the editor-in-chief's password was so I could get into the office computer system as him. How much access you had to different parts of the kind of computer system depended on your seniority within the Times, and I had almost no access because I was a dog's body. And also you could send messages to people, and the name of the person who'd logged in would come up underneath the message. So after about 6 months, one day I was sitting down just noodling around, and I hit on the right password, which was Top Man, all one word, lowercase. I can remember to this day. And I was overjoyed. And the first thing I did, I had this kind of rather supercilious long-haired boss who used to drive around in an open-top MG, which back then was, considered quite a glamorous sports car. This was over 30 years ago. And I sent him a message saying, "Move your car, it's in my bleep space." And it was signed, the editor. And he leapt up from his chair as if he'd been hit with a cattle prod and ran into the car park and moved his car, which wasn't in the editor's space at all. And then I found this list of what all the most senior executives at the newspaper were being paid. And I copied and pasted that and sent it round to all on the computer system. And just generally wreaked havoc. And just had fun, for a week or so. And eventually the IT police tracked me down and I got a summons from the managing editor. And I came out from lunch and was told that he wanted to see me. And I was expecting, a slap on the wrist, but for my bosses to be secretly quite impressed I'd managed to, hack my way into the system. Key skill for a modern investigative reporter. And but I was greeted by, a security guard holding the contents of my desk drawer in a kind of clear plastic bag, and then escorted by the same security guard off the premises. So I lost that job, and I've had 9-to-5 jobs since. I ran the New Schools Network, which is a free school education charity, for a couple of years. But temperamentally, I think I'm not terribly well suited to the 9-to-5 office schedule. I prefer being my own boss.
Yeah, no, absolutely. After that, you ended up at Harvard in the late 80s.
Yeah, that's right. I left the Times and then did a bit of freelancing and then went to Harvard as a Fulbright for a year.
So, because one thing that came up when I was researching for this was, I think that's something quite interesting, just a little sort of tidbit, which is that your father coined the phrase meritocracy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
He wrote a book, I think, which was published in 1957, called The Rise of the Meritocracy, in which he identified what he thought of as a growing phenomenon, a new kind of political dynamic, which he called meritocracy. But the book is a dystopian satire in the same mould as 1984 and Brave New World, in which, as the meritocratic principle becomes the dominant principle in society in the future, the book's set in, I think, 2034, it creates this kind of dystopia, far from, replacing our class system with something fairer and more attractive. It ends up essentially creating another kind of hierarchical society, but in which the class positions are much more rigid and there's much less movement between classes. And
so a lot like Animal Farm then?
A lot like Animal Farm, yeah. It follows the same sort of pattern, and that was clearly the inspiration. And I think he sent it to George Orwell's publisher as his first port of call. It was rejected by him. But it was eventually published and then translated into many different languages, and has become a sort of a seminal political work But yeah, in the course of writing that book, he came up with the word meritocracy. But it just to underline this, it's to describe something he passionately disapproved of,
Right.
not something he thought was good.
Right. Yeah. Sure.
I mean, not because he was, defending the aristocracy. He disapproved of meritocracy because he was a socialist, and he thought that one of the shortcomings of equality of opportunity is that it provides inequality with a patina of legitimacy. If everyone starts out on a level playing field, then the different outcomes somehow seem fairer than if you have a kind of everyone beginning in which the odds are stacked against them or in their favour, depending on who their parents are, where they go to school, etc. So he thought because meritocracy, as he saw it, would extend the life of capitalism by giving this air of legitimacy to socioeconomic inequality and making it seem less unjust than it was to be passionately resisted, because it was an obstacle to the emergence of a fairer society coming.
Right. Right. So this year it's 30 years since you co-founded Modern Review. Looking back on that time, how do you feel about it? Do you feel sort of bittersweet about it, or do you sort of look back on it
I feel
fondly?
pretty proud of the Modern Review too. It did end rather badly. So I co-founded it with Julie Birchall and Cosmo Landesman in 1991, and it had a very successful run. We produced 21 issues, discovered a lot of fantastic writers who published sometimes their first ever pieces in the Modern Review. Writers like Nick Hornby, Will Self, various others. And it had a big impact on the way in which popular culture was covered in the broadsheet press and on Radio 4 and more broadly. Up until we started the Modern Review, the general attitude of TV critics, film critics, book critics writing in the broadsheet press towards mass culture was pretty snobbish and disdainful. It was something to make jokes about, but not something to take seriously. We felt that was out of date, and that some aspects of popular culture deserved the same kind of, we thought were as important as some of the canonical works of Western literature, and deserved the same critical appreciation. Not a particularly controversial idea now, but then it was quite a controversial idea. But it was clearly an idea whose time had come, and it coincided, I think, with a kind of a generational changing of the guard. So lots of new critics who were kind of a lot of the older critics were quite elderly and beginning to retire, and there was a kind of there were young Turks kind of snapping at their heels and gradually taking over their various positions, and this was very much the kind of attitude of the young Turks, that we need to take some aspects of popular culture seriously, not be snobbish or disdainful about it, not just treat it as fodder for kind of making jokes which are essentially kind of contemptuous of the working class or the imagined audience for popular culture, but partly because it was so timely, these young Turks kind of swept into these kind of key positions. Back then, being the film critic of the Sunday Times was considered an absolute plum. Much less so now, but back then, you had real kind of cultural clout. You were taken seriously. You were a figure of some renown if you were the film critic of the Sunday Times, and quite quickly the film critic of the Sunday Times was replaced by the person I'd hired as the literary editor of the Modern Review, Tom Schoen. And then Cosmo Landesman went on to do the job when Tom went to America. But we managed to kind of capture these kind of, the commanding heights of the cultural economy so quickly that the magazine became almost redundant after 4 years. I mean, it was a victim of its own success. And it did end quite badly, with me falling out with Julie and Julie falling out with Cosmo, and Julie wanting to make the girlfriend, she'd left Cosmo for the editor of the magazine, and I shut it down without telling Julie, and produced a kind of greatest hits issue. So it was all a bit messy at the end, but you know, for the rest of the time, it was great, and we had a fantastic time doing it.
Was it like it sounds a bit like a sort of punk rock approach to the highbrow press.
Yeah, it was kind of punky. I think we put on the dummy issue, we had Bart Simpson aiming a catapult at the reader. And I think the headline was Bart on Bart, the ideology of the Simpsons. I'm looking at it right now. But yeah, it was quite punky in many ways. And of course, Julie and I were both punks back in the mid to late 70s. She was a much more prominent one than I was, but nonetheless, we were both kind of excited and stimulated and sort of swept up by that kind of particular musical trend.
The first wave.
The first wave, yeah. So I bought the Sex Pistols album on the day it came out in 1977. Never mind the bollocks. I remember walking down the King's Road with it tucked under my arm and getting some dirty looks from some teddy boys.
Isn't King's Road where the shop Sex was?
Yeah. It was where, I think, was it called Sex, or yeah, it was where Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood's shop was. Yeah, and it was a sort of oddly a sort of ground zero of the kind of punk rock movement, which is odd when you think about it. It was like yards from Chelsea Football Ground, and in one of the kind of poshest parts of London, and full of Sloane Rangers too. But nonetheless, the World's End of the King's Road was the kind of punk end, and the Sloane Square end was the Sloane end. But actually, the battles on the King's Road weren't between punks and Sloanes; they were between punks and teddy boys.
Well, we'll get more into punk later on when we get to your music, but for now, let's get into your list. So your first book is Bonfire of the Vanities.
Yeah, so Bonfire of the Vanities was Tom Wolfe's debut novel. Tom Wolfe was a celebrated American journalist, credited with, if not creating, then certainly coming up with the name for the new journalism, which was a type of reportage which became quite fashionable in the 70s, the 60s and 70s, mainly in America, but not exclusively so, in which the reporter sort of inserted himself into the story, and also imagined conversations which took place between the kind of protagonists in the drama he was reporting on, or she was reporting on. So it's a sort of novelistic way of trying to cover a story. And Tom Wolfe was the absolute master of this particular genre. And I think his masterpiece, when it comes to his journalism, I mean, The Right Stuff is fantastic. His book about the moonshot. But I think his masterpiece is Radical Chic, which is an essay he wrote, I think for New York Magazine, about attending a fundraiser for the Black Panthers at the apartment of Leonard and Felicia Bernstein in New York, which absolutely perfectly captures the kind of insanity of that particular moment, in which the kind of super rich, mega glamorous kind of New York socialites were holding a fundraiser for a group of black militants who, among other things, wanted to release prisoners convicted of murder from jail. I mean, they made BLM look like the SDP, and it was. But it's a perfect piece of satire, marvelously done. And never really been bettered, I don't think. But he clearly always had ambitions, not just to write these kind of novelistic, long pieces of reportage, and not just to do journalism, however creatively, but to also write novels. And his first novel was The Bonfire of the Vanities, and I think it's probably his best. His second, A Man in Full, is almost as good, and then there's quite a sharp drop off in quality. But Bonfire is very, very good. It's about this master of the universe, this young American thruster who works for an investment bank, lives on Park Avenue, I think, is married to a socialite, has the world as his oyster, and one day he is involved in an attempted mugging in the Bronx with his mistress, and he, in the course of trying to escape, accidentally knocks over a young black man, and eventually, the police track him down, and his life implodes. And there are various kind of other characters too, and it sort of captures New York in that era, the late 80s.
Right, yeah, because you have one hand you have yuppies, Wall Street extravagance, and then on the other hand you have a very sort of pre-Giuliani, very gritty New York.
Yes, yeah, it is pretty gritty, and navigating the criminal justice system is something that Sheldon McCoy, the central character, has a great deal of difficulty doing until he enlists the help of this kind of savvy, streetwise attorney. But there are some fantastic characters in the book, including one of the characters is an English journalist who is a kind of dipsomaniac and completely feckless and unreliable and dishonest, but also has a kind of core of integrity as well. And he's based on an actual journalist called Anthony Hayden Guest, who, when I moved to New York, became friends with. I was in New York when the Modern Review went belly up. I moved to New York to work for Vanity Fair and stayed in New York for 5 years. And some of the characters who'd been in Bonfire were still around, still knocking around, including Anthony Hayden Guest, and it was great to get to know him. And there's a fantastic scene at the end of the book as well, when there's a kind of dinner party, by which time Sheldon's number is up and he's about to surrender himself to the police station in the Bronx, and I think it's his kind of last hurrah. And his wife has taken him to this dinner party, and he's amazed to discover that instead of being shunned because he's kind of disgraced his class, they fall on him like fans, just delighted to meet someone so famous and so notorious. But there's one of the characters at this dinner party is based on W.H. Auden, and it's like a cross between Auden and Stephen Spender actually, but delivers this kind of talks about this poem and delivers this kind of rebuke to these kind of vainglorious nincompoops, which is very good. It's the kind of moral heart of the book, but it's excellent. Recommend it to anyone. Very easy read and superbly entertaining.
Wonderful. Your second book is David Copperfield.
Yeah, so I guess I like socially realist novels, and Tom Wolfe actually wrote a piece in which he criticised the kind of various literary trends like magical realism for departing from the main duty of a novelist, which he thought was to kind of capture, the gritty underbelly of kind of contemporary social life, which he very much tried to do, and I think did do very successfully in Bonfire. But probably my favourite social realist novelist, if you can describe him that way, is Charles Dickens, who I guess was probably Tom Wolfe's role model as well. And I think, I've read most, not all of Dickens, but I've read, I'd say, about 90% of his novels. And I think David Copperfield is probably the best. I remember when I read David Copperfield, I read it after reading Nicholas Nickleby, and Nicholas Nickleby feels like a dummy run for David Copperfield, and it's Dickens' most autobiographical book, and there's a character in the book who's clearly based on his father and the early life experience of the central character, in which he has to, he's at one stage his parents are sent to the poorhouse, and he has to work at a very early age in a factory, all based on Dickens's life, early life. But Dickens is I always find such a joy to read. His characters are so vivid. The kind of comic episodes are hilariously funny. He somehow manages to he has this great ability to combine, well-rounded, nuanced, three-dimensional characters who are the central characters with these kind of comic caricatures, sort of beautifully kind of drawn, like kind of marvelous, kind of vivid cartoons. But it's incredibly evocative too of kind of London in the mid 19th century, I'd certainly recommend that too. I think that's my favourite novel of all time.
I think Dickens found it to be his own favourite of his works.
Yes, yeah, I would love to have heard Dickens reading aloud from it. Dickens was a great kind of reader of his own works and used to give public readings to kind of crowds of thousands, in which he would kind of act out all the different parts and do different voices. And I think he had, quite a theatrical kind of flair. And boy, I would have loved to have seen Dickens reading out David Copperfield.
Mm-hmm. I suppose no one does it better in terms of really kind of poking Victorian life like Dickens, right? He talks about things like prostitution, women in marriage, class, justice, schools, child employment. It's really biting, as
Yes.
well as being well written and kind of quite fun to read.
Yes, he has this kind of he was a sort of a 19th century social justice warrior. He is sort of morally outraged by the injustices of 19th century Britain, the appalling conditions in which the poor were forced to live, the iniquity of the poorhouse, the workhouse. I think he was wrong about some of it. I mean, I wouldn't defend, 19th century capitalism or pre-welfare state Britain. I think we've definitely. I think many of the things he was outraged about, he was quite right to be outraged about. But I think he was wrong about education. Interestingly, I think he has this. Is it in? I think it's in Hard Times. He features this school called Do the Boys Hall, and there is a terrible teacher called Mr. Gradgrind. Dickens was fantastic at coming up with names, evocative names for his characters. So Mr. Gradgrind thinks facts are all that matter, and the children are just essentially sitting there, kind of learning facts by rote in this kind of factory-like satanic mill that is a schoolhouse. But I think Dickens was wrong, and I think that kind of romantic view of what education should be, and that kind of hatred of the kind of prioritizing the learning of facts and knowledge more broadly. I think that was a wrong turning, and one of the things I tried to do when I set up the West London Free School was to create a school which prioritized the teaching of subject-based knowledge. It was never, we never hired a Mr. Gradgrind, and it certainly wasn't and isn't Do the Boys Hall. But I think Dickens was on the wrong track when it came to his critique of education.
Do you think it's insulting to refer to it as a coming of age story? Because when I had Peter Hitchens on this show, his choice was Great Expectations. Yeah. And I referred to it as a Bildungsroman, and I think he took issue with that.
I'd say that David Copperfield is more of a coming-of-age story than Great Expectations, and partly because it is so clearly autobiographical. Great Expectations. The other characters kind of occupy more space in the novel, in addition to the central character, whereas David Copperfield is really dominated by just the one character whom you follow from kind of childhood to manhood. I don't know. Why was Peter cross about that?
I don't know. I think he just thought it was an oversimplification, it probably was. It probably was.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it was an area where I think my my sort of youthful naivety kind of came out more than I wanted it to. We'll move along there to your third book, which is The Way We Live Now, and another sort of satirical take on
Yeah.
things.
So it was the first book I read by Anthony Trollope, and it's about this kind of glamorous, slightly mysterious, very rich financier, who moves up through English society, at lightning pace, taking everyone in. And he turns out to be a sort of Bernie Madoff figure, and it's all a kind of pyramid scheme. And eventually, it's all exposed, and he's disgraced, and so are his family. Um, but it's sort of marvelously. What's great about The Way We Live Now is that it feels so contemporary. Um, you know, these chances are always amongst us, and they're always kind of given the benefit of the doubt by the kind of rich and powerful,
Mm.
and often have no difficulty kind of taking people in because people just love kind of powerful rich men, and think they can confer some of their power and their riches on them. So it's a wonderful satire of kind of the sort of English plutocratic class, which kind of has not dated, and and it also was a kind of gateway drug for me, and I went on to read a lot more Trollope, which I very much enjoyed. I don't think he's quite up there with Dickens, but he's not far behind.
Mm. 'Cause it's based somewhat around real events, right? It's inspired by the Panic of 1873, where this sort of set of financial scandals in across Europe and North America.
Yeah, I think that's right. Uh, I don't know. It was a while since I've read it, so I can't remember the kind of backstory to the creation of the novel. But it was clearly a world that Trollope had researched properly and knew very well. I mean, you get the impression when reading Trollope, as you do when reading Dickens, and of course Dickens started off at one stage as a parliamentary reporter, is that they weren't just great novelists; they were great reporters, and you can see why that kind of novel inspired Tom Wolfe to write Bonfire of the Vanities. Um, they clearly did an enormous amount of kind of legwork and research and took copious notes and really mastered the worlds they were describing, and made sure they got all the detail exactly right. Um, uh, uh, yeah, and the extraordinary thing about Trollope, of course, is that he was incredibly prolific, more prolific, I think, than Dickens. Produced more novels, but in addition to kind of writing these books and doing all the research necessary to produce them, he also had a full-time job as a postmaster, and used to travel, by horse from London to Dublin and that kind of thing. So I mean, maybe that's where he did his composing, on horseback, kind of on these long, grueling journeys. Yeah, he was unbelievably productive and prolific. Really impressive.
Hmm. We'll move along there to music, and we are back onto punk, and your first choice is Anarchy in the UK.
Yeah, I guess I I chose that because I was completely swept up by the punk movement. I was 13 when Anarchy for the UK was released, possibly 12. I think 13. I had an older sister, a couple of years older, and she was really into music. So it was really through her that I discovered punk. And I had this friend called Remy, who was a DJ, who was a year older than me. And I remember when we would go to parties together, and he would DJ, and he worked at this club where he DJed, and it was like a youth club. And so we all used to hang out in this group we called The Group, and dance to Remy's music. And I remember Remy starting to play punk in '76, and it was initially quite unpopular with the group. We liked ska. We liked kind of soul classics, stuff that was easy to dance to, like James Brown's Sex Machine and Hot Chocolate's You Sexy Thing.
Yeah,
And we were 13, 14. But after a while, I began to change my mind about the punk Remy was playing and got into it. And I don't think Anarchy for the UK was the first punk record I bought. I think the first record I bought was Peaches by the Stranglers as a single. Back then, we used to buy 45s. And I was in a band, and I taught myself to play guitar. And typical teenager, I would stand in front of the mirror with my guitar, playing Anarchy for the UK. And I remember thinking at the time, in my naivety, that the lyrics of this song perfectly expressed my political philosophy. And I thought of myself then as an anarchist. And actually, I think when I see anarchists going on marches to demand, more funds for the NHS, or kick out the Tories, or whatever it is, essentially campaigning, protesting for a bigger state, which has more draconian powers to tax its citizens. It's like, I feel like they've parted company with the original ideas of anarchism far more than I have as a sort of libertarian conservative. I don't think there's that much distance between, the Sex Pistols and where I am now. They've gone, 180 degrees.
It's interesting that you mentioned that you listened to it and you got into your room and started trying to play it on guitar, because there's that sort of urban legend around their gig in Manchester that supposedly everyone was at, right? Supposedly the guys from Joy Division were there, Mick Hucknall was there apparently. It's kind of I think a lot of people who probably witnessed the first wave of punk probably had a very similar response to you, where they saw it and thought, this is completely unlike anything you'd seen before. It completely broke down the barrier that prior was between the rock star and the audience, to the point where they're 5 feet away from you and you can touch them.
Yeah, that was yeah. I think I liked and related to the punk kind of do-it-yourself philosophy. You don't have to be trained, you don't have to be an expert, you don't have to have any credentials. You can just start a band in your garage, or start a radio station, or start a TV station, and that kind of even though people think of the Sex Pistols and other kind of prominent punks as being kind of anti-establishment sort of Republicans, there was something about there was a sort of a celebration of entrepreneurialism implicit in the punk movement, which later was embodied by Thatcherism. So I think there's this lovely golden thread connecting, Johnny Rotten, Margaret Thatcher, and Boris Johnson. Though Boris's libertarian conservative credentials may be somewhat in doubt now, but until recently anyway, he's now parted company with his punk heritage. I think that really appealed to me. Incidentally, I never saw the Sex Pistols. The big gig in London that a football stadium's worth of people claimed to have been to was the Sex Pistols gig at the Screen on the Green in Islington. But even though I lived in Islington, I didn't make it to that gig, really frustratingly. But I did see lots of other bands. Saw the Adverts, the Buzzcocks. Saw the Clash a couple of times. And actually, at one stage, my band supported The Cure. So that was the high point of my musical career. Was when Captain Scarlet and the Mysterons, as we called ourselves, supported The Cure at Totnes Town Hall. And we hung out backstage with The Cure, and they were incredibly nice and friendly and encouraging. And this was before they were a kind of stadium band. They were just one of the more interesting punk bands back then. But yeah, met a lot of really, really interesting, great people.
Do you think, in a way, punk was kind of the first wave of punk was kind of doomed to kind of end after a few years, just because the people in punk bands kind of got better? Let me qualify that. So by saying that, I think London Calling, which we'll get onto next, is it's sure it's a punk record ostensibly, but is in the title track. But also there's a lot of influences of rockabilly and sort of more American influences as well. And also you had John Lydon formed Public Image Limited. Warsaw became Joy Division, and it became post punk as they kind of, as musicians, they kind of matured a bit more.
Yeah, I think it certainly evolved quite quickly, and some of the kind of some of the directions in which it went kind of weren't particularly great. Never really cared for kind of sort of more mainstream new romantic type music, but never went for Duran Duran. But in other respects, it evolved in interesting and creative ways. I never sort of bought into the kind of sellout mentality whereby as soon as anyone enjoyed any success, and started earning money and improving their lifestyle, they were a sellout. That was never. I never kind of jumped on that particular bandwagon. And I mean, I think one of the interesting things is that back then, the great criticism of punk made by the older generation was that it was so unmusical. It was just three chords. None of these people could really play their instruments. And it wouldn't last for that reason. It was a flash in the pan. And quite unlike music produced by the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, etc. But actually, interestingly, a lot of it has lasted. And London Calling is a good example. Football grounds across London introduce people to the stadiums on match days by playing London Calling, including at Queen's Park Rangers, which is the team I support. It's become a kind of London anthem. It's kind of lost its associations with kind of that sort of anti-establishment, rebellious ethic, and it's now become a kind of, a kind of a sort of modern day version of Maybe It's Because I'm a Londoner.
Yeah, they
or New York.
Right. Yeah, they played it during the Olympics opening ceremony.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so
I love it. I mean, I absolutely love it.
Oh,
whenever I hear it, it sends shivers up my spine.
Yeah, no, it's a brilliant record, and let's get into it. 'Cause, I mean, obviously everyone knows the title track, but there are other great songs now. I really like Rudy Can't Fail, which is, again, like I was saying, there was other sort of non-punk influences on it. Rudy Can't Fail. What's another one?
Police and Thieves. I love that. I love their cover version of Police and Thieves.
Yeah. So let's move along there then to your last music song, which is not punk. It's, you mentioned them earlier, the Rolling Stones. It's "Sympathy for the Devil."
Yeah. So I've always liked classic rock, and I like the Stones. And I went through a kind of Rolling Stones phase where I listened to almost nothing else, and I think I like the kind of celebration of sin and sort of non-conformity in Sympathy for the Devil, and it's sort of almost Mick Jagger kind of riffing on his own sort of reputation as a sort of Lucifer-like character coming to steal the souls of kind of young women, as well as other things. And it's sort of the Stones reveling in their sort of bad boy reputation, but it's also just a great song with a great riff and a great guitar solo, which comes back in again at the end. And when have you seen them? I haven't actually seen them. I've never seen the Stones live, but I've seen different footage of them performing "Sympathy for the Devil," and it works really well
Mm.
as a live track too. And I imagine I would imagine if it's quite often their kind of encore show-stopping,
Yeah,
kind
well,
of bring the house down song.
I saw them about 3 years ago, and yeah, it was their closer.
Right.
It
Yeah.
yeah, and you make a point about Jagger being this sort of yeah, I do sort of see him as this kind of like Byronic, kind of Lucifer type, sort of sauntering type figure. But I found the song always reminded me of Paradise Lost. Yeah, sort of the devil kind of meandering throughout history, kind of corrupting and machinating, and he mentions like Pontius Pilate and that sort of thing.
Yes. Yeah. No, it's full of kind of biblical references, isn't it?
Mm.
Um, yeah, but it imagines the devil, as you say, sort of moving through history in different guises, in different cultures. But the implication is that Jagger is the modern manifestation of this dangerous, diabolical, kind of disruptive figure. Um, but yeah, it's a. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's sort of also the Stones kind of trolling Christian fundamentalists, which they've done for decades. But it's probably the best and most exciting example of that, I'd say. And it's harder to understand the impact it would have made out of context. But back then, Christianity was still a powerful force, a powerful cultural force, certainly in Britain and America and across the Anglosphere.
Right.
And singing a song which appeared to be kind of celebrating the works of the devil, even with that title, was a pretty controversial and
Yeah, because we were what, like 2 years past the Beatles record burnings.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And let's not forget that the Life of Brian, when it was released some years later, was banned in Scotland and banned in some English cinemas and banned in most US states because it was considered so incredibly offensive, so blasphemous.
Yeah, even though it's not about the whole thing is that
Not
he's
a
not
not a
Jesus.
man called
Yeah,
Brian. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll move along there to your film, which is Rio Bravo.
Yeah. So uh, I guess I as a sort of young teenager, even before I became a teenager, I received this kind of film education, essentially by the programmer of the BBC Two film schedule. Back then when you were just confined to three channels: BBC One, BBC Two, and ITV. If you liked films, you had to wait for them to come on. There was no streaming, nothing available on demand. If you wanted to go to the cinema, you could do that once a fortnight if you had enough money, and that's what I spent my pocket money on. But that was once a fortnight. So really, I was almost wholly dependent to feed my film habit on the films that were on telly, and the best films were on BBC Two, and they would have seasons of films. So like at Christmas there would be a Fred Astaire season, or a film noir season, or a gangster season, or a western season, and particularly during the kind of holidays. And that's really how I received my film education. And I sometimes pity my own children because they can choose almost anything and have any movie they want to watch available at their fingertips. They just choose kind of like rubbish. They're not forced to kind of educate themselves by having a limited amount of choice. But I was, and I'm grateful for that. And it was because of that that I acquired a love of westerns, a genre which my children, I think they're sort of only dimly aware exists. And I think Rio Bravo is my favourite western. I think it's I think it's Howard Hawks is probably one of the best American directors and probably the best director of westerns. And it stars John Wayne.
Hmm.
It's the central character in his pomp, in his prime, and it's got this this wonderful actor. What's he called again? Hang on a second. I'm going to look him up on. It's a while since I've seen it.
Dean Martin. I think Dean Martin.
Dean Martin.
Yeah.
Dean Martin plays John Wayne's kind of sidekick who rehabilitates. And Ricky Nelson plays this kind of strolling banjo player for musical interludes. Angie.
Yeah, because Ricky Nelson was a singer, wasn't he?
He was a singer. Yeah. And Angie Dickinson plays John Wayne's love interest. Now, the character I was trying to think of, the actor I was trying to think of, is Walter Brennan.
Right.
He has a gammy leg, so his name in the film is Stumpy. Now, you wouldn't call a disabled person in a film Stumpy these days, but he's a fantastic character and a fantastic actor. He crops up in all sorts of westerns and not just westerns. He's one of those great kind of character actors who kind of enlivened American classic films in the kind of 40s and 50s. He played Judge Roy Bean. That was his kind of tour de force. In I think it's called. Is it the film with the same name? Can't remember. Maybe not. Maybe it's called The Westerner. Anyway, yeah. So that I think is my favourite western. I also really like The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, which also stars John Wayne, but alongside Jimmy Stewart. That is a fantastic western as well, and Wayne is in some respects better in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance because he plays this kind of almost outlaw anti-hero, kind of unredeemed, undomesticated kind of roughneck, whereas he plays kind of the sheriff in Rio Bravo. But yeah, Rio Bravo is I haven't. My kids keep saying, when are we going to watch Rio Bravo? It's your favourite film of all time. We want to know what you like about it. And I'm a bit nervous about watching it with them because I just... sometimes when I've watched films I've really liked with my kids, when I was their age, I've kind of seen it through their eyes and the film seems terribly slow and dated. And I'm worried that Rio Bravo might seem a bit like that. But one of these days I'm going to sit them down to watch it.
What do you think of the sort of the latter westerns, sort of the spaghetti westerns and Leone's films?
Yeah, I love spaghetti westerns. So they were my favorite. So you had like on BBC Two, you had spaghetti western seasons, and they would play the kind of Sergio Leone, Clint Eastwood trilogy. I absolutely loved them. Clint Eastwood was my childhood hero. I wanted to be able to kind of take out kind of the bad guys who were threatening me, without having to break stride with my kind of six shooter.
With a cigarette still in your mouth, yeah.
Yeah, and the banjo's still on. I was mesmerised, spellbound by Clint Eastwood, and I'm still a huge Clint Eastwood fan. I mean, he's had an extraordinary career, and from being cast in those films to then being cast in the Dirty Harry films, and then becoming a very successful, very good director in his own right. Directed a great western called Unforgiven, but has directed some fantastic films as well, other films. So yeah, no, I was and still am a huge Clint Eastwood fan and love those Sergio Leone films.
Moving along there, we'll go to your object, which I always say is my favourite one to go over because everyone's is completely different. Yours is a laptop.
Yeah, I guess it's a rather unimaginative choice, but I'm utterly dependent on my laptop. So it's open in front of me for at least 10 hours a day, sometimes more. And I love the kind of independence it gives me.
Right.
So,
yeah.
As a journalist, it doesn't matter where I am in the world. If I can write my column from there thanks to my laptop. I mean, I remember the days when you used to have to kind of you had to literally telephone a copy taker at, say, the Evening Standard and dictate your copy to them. And then it would appear in the paper the following day in a completely garbled state. So I love being able to just write anywhere, on the tube, on an aeroplane. I mean, of course, it's in combination with the internet that you can do that. But also, I set up this anti-lockdown blog called Lockdown Skeptics last year, and just produced that from my laptop. And I can sort of post new things on it and moderate comments and that kind of thing from my phone, but it's a lot harder. It's easier to do on my laptop. So, but the idea that you can produce this kind of website from your desk is fantastic. So yeah, it's because it's been a huge career asset to me having this. It's enabled me both to kind of continue to work as a journalist in spite of not being not by temperament being suited to offices, and it's also kind of enabled me to do lots of other things as well.
Is it also sort of, I suppose, symbolic of your own success in transcending the office that you don't feel drawn to?
Maybe I hadn't thought about it like that, but yeah, now you put it so eloquently. Yes, perhaps that's what it is. I kind of I like the fact that I mean I've been when I was at Harvard, I bought my first Apple Mac, and it's now still in my attic, and I'm told could be worth something, because 34-year-old Apple Macs are apparently can be auctioned off on eBay for considerable sums. So one of these days I'm going to have to look into that market. But they got me young, and I've been a kind of Apple man ever since. We were burgled not so long ago, in which the burglar only took Apple products, nothing else. But the amount of Apple products they managed to take from me, and it took about 12, I think. They had so many of these damn things, and not 12 laptops, but iPads and iPods and iPhones and God knows what else. And that brought home to me what a kind of Apple addict I've become, and how indiscriminate I am when it comes to buying Apple products. But I do love Apple products, and I particularly love their latest MacBook Pro.
Do you think the burglar saw the original Mac and thought, nah?
Well, no, I don't want to advertise the existence of this valuable item to other potential burglars, but no, he didn't find it.
Okay, good. Your historical figure is Ord Wingate.
Yeah, I came across Ord Wingate in, I think, Wilfrid Thesiger's autobiography. And because Thesiger, who was, I think, in the SAS at one stage, worked with Ord Wingate, who was a British general who was responsible for the liberation of Ethiopia, amongst other things. And Thesiger's description of Wingate is incredibly evocative, and there's something very appealing about him, I thought. And then I subsequently read a bit more about him and found out a bit more about him, and he was this kind of quite appealing figure. He was unbelievably. He had this kind of strong. He had a real problem with authority, so he was an incredibly bad at obeying orders, and for that reason, even though he was a gifted soldier, his career in the British Army was thwarted. And at one point, he was dispatched to Palestine, as it then was, and I think he was dispatched to Palestine to quell the kind of burgeoning rebellion by kind of Jewish militias in the territory, who were kind of Zionists and agitating for the creation of the state of Israel. But he completely ignored his orders. I may be getting the story slightly wrong, but not that wrong. and essentially when he sort of he had always, from a very early age, when he was a schoolboy, he was incredibly unpopular, and because he was such a difficult, awkward person, and so quarrelsome and kind of so unwilling to give an inch on anything. He was very unpopular at school and often spent a lot of time in the school library and read up on the history of the Jews. And even though he wasn't Jewish himself, he identified with the Jews because he identified with a people who'd been persecuted as he felt he was being persecuted. So when he went to Palestine, instead of helping these Jewish militias, instead of trying to kind of quash these uprisings, he completely joined them essentially, and helped develop the kind of guerrilla warfare tactics that proved so effective, not just in Palestine and in the creation of the state of Israel, but more widely. And then in the Second World War, Churchill, I think, rescued him and recognised his gifts as a leader, and he was put in charge of the kind of British Expeditionary Force in Ethiopia, and managed to liberate Ethiopia from the Italians, even though they vastly outnumbered the British, and even though he was doing it very much in the teeth of orders to kind of stand down and surrender. And Thessiger was part of that particular campaign, and he went on to run the Chindits, who were a kind of commando force in Burma, with huge success. And he was actually killed before the war ended, but he's now buried, I think, on the Mount of Olives in Israel, just outside Jerusalem.
Yeah, no. The thing about him that I find the most striking is a very sort of I think it's sort of a very kind of British approach to warfare. It's kind of unconventional, kind of plucky, almost crude approach to modern warfare. Because I mean, around the time, so the war saw the birth of the SAS, as you mentioned earlier, whose early missions were basically they would just drive up to German planes and blow them up and just drive away again, in the dead of night. It's there's something I don't know, there's something very kind of plucky and almost twee about it, but it's it was very effective.
He was quite punky in many ways. Yeah. He had a problem with authority. He extemporized. He had a kind of entrepreneurial flair, but was incredibly effective. Was a really gifted war leader, and it was partly thanks to the success of his raids on Japanese kind of ammunition dumps behind enemy lines in Burma. I mean, up until then, the Japanese had been thought of as absolutely invincible. This kind of mythology had grown up around the Japanese soldier as this kind of Superman. And the Japanese had just swept everything before them. And it was a real morale boost for kind of the British armed forces to see these kind of succession of raids being successfully carried out against the Japanese by Wingate and his Chindits, which eventually turned the tide of the war.
And lastly, your modern figure is a colleague of yours, Catherine Burblesing.
Yeah, I have a guilty conscience about Catherine because when the West London Free School first opened, she applied for the job of head teacher, and I didn't even interview her, which in retrospect was a colossal error. She has proved, I think, to be the most gifted head teacher of her generation, and I think in my defence, even though I didn't think she'd be the right person to head up the West London Free School, which I think I was wrong about, I did do what I could to help her secure a site so she could open a free school and run a free school herself, which she subsequently did manage to do. So she opened, I think, the Michaela Community School in 2014, 3 years after the West London Free School, and it's always been quite a controversial school, because it has this very strict behavior management policy, and she's kind of a big promoter of British culture and British values, and think that's really important for kind of to give people a sense of identity and cohesion, and so she'll have her kids march into lunch reciting Kipling's "If," which obviously triggers a lot of people on the left, it being a kind of celebration of the white man's burden, or not exactly, but that's certainly one way to read it. So it's a very controversial school, and she got a huge amount of flack from the teaching unions and kind of left-wing professors in the teaching world, but the first set of GCSE results in 2019 were just stunning, and some schools that get stunning GCSE results, even state schools, have quite affluent intakes, but Michaela Community School is in Wembley, and not even in a kind of nice bit of Wembley, in a sort of warehouse type building, an office block, and so she you can't accuse her of kind of starting with the odds stacked in her favour. Just a very ordinary group of local children in Wembley, and got, I think, the best GCSE results of any non-selective state school in the country, even better than the West London Free Schools GCSE results that year. I think at Michaela in 2019, 51% of all the students got 7, 8, or 9 in their GCSEs. So that's A star or A in more than half of the GCSEs they took. In the West London Free School that year, it was 50%. So they did slightly better than us. But we'd had a few goes at it by then, and that was her first go, and incredibly impressive. And she's now, the same kid went on to the sixth form. I think her first sixth formers graduated this year. I remember trying to persuade, when I was the head of the New Schools Network, which was a charity that promotes free schools and helps parent groups, teacher groups set them up. I remember trying to persuade Catherine to let a friend of mine make a documentary about Michaela, because when you go and visit Michaela, it's so impressive. The children are such a fantastic advertisement for the school and for everything she's trying to do at the school, and for that particular approach to education. I thought if we could make a documentary about Michaela, 5% of people watching the documentary, mostly kind of creative middle class Guardian reading liberals, are going to think this is ghastly, this is Do the Boys Hall, she's the modern incarnation of Mr. Gradgrind. 95% of people watching it are going to say, why can't my child be at a school like that? And I couldn't persuade her initially. She thought it was a bit too risky, and was a bit wary of kind of letting a camera crew loose, in her school, which is fair enough, particularly when at that stage they didn't have any GCSE results. But she subsequently decided it was a good idea, and she's now made that documentary with this friend of mine. And I think it's about to be broadcast on Channel 4, and I expect it to have the effect I predicted it would.
We've kind of gone full circle here, because we started out talking about the pride you feel towards your work with the schools, and now we've ended on the success story of yourself and Catherine. Do you think that this will be your lasting legacy, the impact you've had on education?
Yeah, probably. I mean, I think of. I like to think that the Free Speech Union, which is a non-partisan mass membership public interest body that stands up for the speech rights of its members and campaigns for free speech more widely, which I set up with some other people last year, and which I'm now the General Secretary of. I like to think that that will have, a long, storied history. We've opened, a sister organisation has opened in New Zealand called the New Zealand Free Speech Union. There's another sister organisation which we started in America, officially launching in a couple of months. And I'm hoping that within 5 years there'll be free speech unions across the Anglosphere doing the work that we've been doing in the UK. But that seems to be, it's too early to say whether organisations like the Free Speech Union will be successful in turning the tide of cancel culture. But it's already, I think, having an impact. And I do think that, just when you think we've reached peak woke, then something else happens and you realise we're not yet. We're still in the foothills. But peak woke, if we haven't reached it, is surely approaching. At which point, there'll probably be that it'll start to decline. And I hope that the free speech unions across the Anglosphere can play a big part in that decline.
Lastly, in sort of more general terms, how would you like to be remembered after you're gone?
I suppose I'd like to be remembered. Probably, I think it'd be nice to be remembered for my work in education, setting up the Free Speech Union, writing, a best-selling memoir, starting the Modern Review, having had a kind of, an interesting career, and having been involved in lots of interesting projects. But I hope, I think, like most people who write, I want to be remembered more for my writing than for anything else. And I sort of worry that at my funeral, or perhaps at my memorial service in Westminster Abbey, one of my Spectator columns will be read out. I've been probably one of the things I'm proudest of is that I've been a weekly columnist for the Spectator since 1998 and haven't missed 1 week. I think a column by me has been published in every issue of the Spectator published since sort of mid 1998. And I'm hoping to extend that record as long as I possibly can before being carted off to the knackers yard. But at my funeral, I expect one of my Spectator columns to be read out, and I sort of slightly worry it'll be the wrong one. It has to be, it has to be the funniest one I ever wrote. So even though it'll be a sad occasion in which people are choking back the tears, they'll also be roaring with laughter. And I sort of worry that the best one won't be found, and they'll read a kind of second-rate one. So I better start thinking about and planning my memorial service to make sure that doesn't happen.
Toby Young, that was your Life in 10.